one of the things that you do that kind of sparked this conversation between you and I on coming on to Coach Replay is you are working with a large mentoring program here in the US, and you're focusing on educator well-being, not only for the mentors, which are very important, but also for those new teachers, because these things like unnecessarily overwhelming ourselves with these things, adjusting to this kind of change in the rhythm of our health habits. And struggle number two, which is getting lost, our self-care gets lost in this set of way too many other priorities, especially as a new teacher. Everything feels of urgency and too little too late almost. And I think that is like, that's something that you're really passionate about, not only because you come from a family of educators and are one formerly yourself, but like, how do we navigate the stress of that? So I love that you kind of are doing that actively as a health coach, really focusing on that, especially with our new teachers. So let's talk a little bit about struggle too. So when our self-care, not only is it we're kind of out of rhythm, but just the things that we should be doing for self-care, the things that are going to help us the most, are getting kind of pushed to the side, put on the back burner because there's so many other important things to be doing right now. Talk a little bit about that and what we might do to support that.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. The term self-care itself, I think, makes it difficult, especially for teachers
Mm-hmm.
who just have these hearts of gold, servants' hearts. They have so many things that they're responsible for. And the idea of self-care, I think a lot of times people conflate that with self-indulgence. And that's not what self-care is. If you really understand it at its core, the word care, think of any other context that you use the word care. You're thinking of when you go see a doctor for care. You're thinking of the care that you show your students, the care that your parents show you, the care of your family, friends. I mean, this is a great idea when you think about care. But for some reason, when we add that word self in front of it, we think of it as self-indulgent. So I think really the biggest thing is to rethink that word. It's not just bubble baths. It's not just manicures. It's not just chocolate. Granted, it could be if that's what you need at that point in time. But there's so much more to it. This resource here that I just really love from the positive psychology movement, it breaks self-care into different categories. And I think that's what makes it a little more helpful, that you could latch on and say, oh, this is an okay thing for me to do, even though I'm in charge of all these students and I have family obligations and everything else. When you break it down into physical ways that you care for yourself, psychological, emotional ways that you care for yourself, spiritually, how do you care for yourself? Thinking about your relationships, your personal life, how are you caring in that area of your life? And even, I actually really love this one, is that there is a concept of professional self-care. And I would put at the very top of the list, like if you see that on this resource, my favorite, and I push this a lot, and it's the hardest one to do, but it's saying no. And this time of year, especially, it's hard to say no. You have all these invitations to places, you have all these ideas. I mean, parents get so excited this time of year and they want to do this and they want to do that. And it's hard to say no because they're excited. But there may be some times where, professionally speaking, it's better for you, it's better for the students if you say no. Like, no, we're not going to have this special party gathering, whatever. We don't have the time for it. We don't have the bandwidth for it. There are other priorities on the table right now. We don't want to overwhelm the students. There's so many ways to practice self-care beyond just physical things. And I think that's probably the best starting point for folks, is that you start to realize the impact that it can have. It's not just a personal thing, it can be a professional thing. And I love exploring that idea with people because it's like eye-opening. It's kind of freeing when they realize, oh, this is like good for my job. This is good for my students if you're a teacher. It's a powerful way to look at self-care. It's not just self-indulgent activities, that these are ways where you're going to be able to pay it forward because now you are replenished and nourished.
Yeah, I think one of the things on that list for the professional ones that teachers don't do enough of and should is take all of their sick and vacation days. There's a feeling of, because we have summers off, we shouldn't take any time for ourselves. And I hate that that's part of the narrative and how people feel, because I mean, take a day and go to the spa, or take a day and do nothing. I have a weighted blanket I just purchased, which was the best $30 I've ever spent in my life, because I can just sit under that blanket and I feel like a warm hug. It just feels like I'm being hugged. I'm not a hugger, but I like it, you know? It just kind of, it works for me. But like, I think teachers often feel guilty about taking those days. And they're there for a reason. And if you haven't, don't take them all in the same day. Like, be kind to to your people that have to cover your class, but don't feel guilty about taking a day just because you need it.
And I think some of that stems from, we've got to, there's so much preparation and planning that feels like we have to go into, getting us up for the day, or if you're working with, a special population of students, that it's a lot harder to just kind of get someone in there. But, there are oftentimes people who that you can kind of get to know, and you can request those certain people who kind of know your class, know how it runs, like get to know those people throughout your career. And that, I think, also makes it easier, and you don't have to have it all through. Some sub plan is nice, please, thank you, as someone who used to sub a lot before I became a full-time teacher. But it's also not that you have to have this elaborate plan, just so you can be out, and you don't have to necessarily be sick, right? I love that you said, Joanna, the learning to say no. And Kim and I have both kind of talked about this a bit through kind of our Instagram reels and stories throughout this year, and probably more to come as we continue this theme of navigating stress into the December month. But again, going back to, not only can we use this for ourselves, but how do we help someone else engage in these activities? It reminds me of one of my favorite coaching questions, kind of towards the end of that coaching session. Okay, if we're going to say yes to these things, if we're saying yes to these little 2-inch steps now on this staircase, what do we have to say no to make this easier? And it's okay to say no to something that is, typically a part of your routine. Those are some of my favorite things to say no to sometimes, because it's then easy to pick those right back up, and like, we're gonna set that down because we want to focus over here. But then when we just get everything situated in our hands, we can pick that back up. Other times it's things that we should leave down there and never pick back up again. So, and sometimes it's just this, saying no to the idea that it's got to be perfect and it's got to go 100% well, and I've got to be consistent from the get-go, right? What's your experience with that, Joanna?
Oh man, one of my favorite coaches puts it perfectly, is you can't chase too many rabbits. If you try to chase multiple rabbits, you're not going to catch any of them, right? And so just pick your rabbit, right? And pretty good is pretty good. You mentioned the idea of it being perfect and having it on all the time. I think a lot of times people see their health as a switch, and you have to turn it on or turn it off. Like, somebody turned it off, I got to turn it back on again. And that's not how it works. That if you're waiting for that wave for you to just turn everything on, you're going to end up disappointed every single day, because there's going to be a failure somewhere in there. So I always like to think of it as just, it's a dial, and you turn that dial a little bit. You give yourself time to adjust to it. Think about a light switch, but a dial instead. Sometimes if you just turn it on right away, it's really, really bright, right? So the dial idea helps you acclimate to a new level of whatever health habit you're working on, or whatever idea that you're mulling around. But it allows you that freedom. And sometimes you're going to nudge that dial back down, and that's okay. Hopefully you never turn it off, but hey, life hits, right? That doesn't mean you can't flip it back on, nudge it a little bit, but every day you just make a little nudge in the dial. Wait to get used to it before you nudge that dial up even further. And hey, if that takes a year or 2 or 5, that's fine. But it sure beats the idea of waiting for an opportunity to flip the switch, because I don't think that's ever going to happen. Hasn't happened for me yet. I don't know about you guys, but that never tends to work.
Yeah, I like the idea too that you know, you can kind of start over each day. You know, maybe your dial resets or something. I like to kind of think that each day is a new start too, to achieving whatever your goals are.